context that the leader of opposition has already provided, we can safely assume that these privatized companies are in fact profit-oriented, as he has already said by explaining the dynamics between them. And we ask you a question then. What is more important to you? The welfare of these poor people who can't afford these kinds of drugs, or the profit that you create when you actually build up the markup of these kinds of drugs and sell it for a higher price? Now, before I go on, I want to rebut the previous speaker by firstly saying one thing. We believe, firstly, by saying that we find it is completely ridiculous and bigoted to say that the government can't actually provide for the kind of research funds for these kinds of, these kinds of new drugs and these kinds of things, simply because of the fact that this is already inside the healthcare package, and the fact is that there are other alternatives already for funding. That's why the government can already provide or can already fund for stem cell research. That's why they can fund for all of these kinds of things. And stem cell research is not something cheap, it's something expensive. And since we can believe already that the government can already provide for these kinds of funds, and even if they can, then there are still other NGOs and other people who still provide for grants and still provide for these kinds of medical funds to actually provide for these kinds of scientific researches. And we believe that in the end, that is not something mutually exclusive, because in both sides, we find that funding still happens, except in our side, we make it the drugs more accessible to the other people. Secondly, he talks about how exactly the cycle of research will, be stopped. Well, firstly, we believe that we respond to this by saying that innovation still happens on both sides. There will always be a need for other new kinds of drugs and other new kinds of things, simply because of the fact that sicknesses also develop themselves and sicknesses also modernize. When influenza happened, they still had to provide for new kinds of drugs. And because of this, these people will still need to find their kinds of, new kinds of drugs and still fund new scientific researches to provide and explain and stop these kinds of new sicknesses from happening. So, thirdly, on the level of competition, we believe that competition still happens within these things, because these scientists will still need to prove and innovate their own kinds of drugs and their own kinds of scientific researches, because the government still has to provide on which people actually get these grants and which people actually get these funding within their kinds of society. Which is why these people will still try and innovate and create better kinds of drugs for these people. And thirdly, on the level of the misconception that they seem to find, we're not stopping scientific research. Please sit down. We're saying that the governments will fund the scientists instead of actually saying that these pharmaceutical companies will fund them anyway. So moving on to my constructives, I want to first talk about how doing something like this is actually, your policy is actually elitist in nature, and it's something that actually marginalizes other people. Because as my partner has already proven, if these companies are so profit-oriented and are so, convinced within their own kinds of delusions, that they will still be able to mark up these kinds of rates, then these kinds of poor people will not be able to access these kinds of medicines. Because if everybody was as rich and if medicine was as accessible as they like to paint it, then I'd ask you a question as to why there are so many poor people in third world countries who can't afford these kinds of drugs, and why are there so many people in Africa who can't afford these kinds of drugs. So firstly, I want to talk to you about how these kinds of, what exactly is the trade-off between pharmaceutical companies increasing the markup and the cheaper drugs that we want to provide. Firstly, their trade-off is something, please sit down. Their trade-off is basically by increasing the markup of their profit, these people will still be able to provide for the pharmaceutical companies themselves and for the richer people who will be able to afford these drugs. Simply because of the fact that when a drug is too expensive, then people who have no money will not be able to buy it. And we have to face a reality here. Not everybody has the money to buy these drugs, which is why the state has to make it more accessible to these people. But when you only cater to a specific certain category of people, which is only the richer people and the people who can afford these kinds of drugs, then the fact of the matter is that these poor people get marginalized because they can't actually afford afford these drugs. And because the companies get a surplus of money and these kinds of things actually just benefit for themselves and the higher class people who can afford these drugs, we find that the principle itself of doing something like this is elitist in nature. Because once again, we have to remind and reiterate the fact that people in third world countries still can't afford these kinds of drugs. And when you heighten the markup rate, heighten the markup rate of these kinds of drugs, then these poor people can buy it. Because simply, even if you talk about how these governments still subsidize these companies still have a stake there. They still have their patents, and because of this, they still have an amount of ownership rights. And because they still have an amount of ownership rights, they can still create their patents and they can still market up to something that is more expensive than what a state-funded scientifically researched drug can actually be accessible to these people. And because of these reasons, we find that these kinds of trade-offs can actually happen and actually are harmful to the people. And on the extension that in the conjecture that these actually companies or private pharmaceutical companies actually fund these kinds of things that are more unethical, because these kinds of private companies are more profit-oriented and they basically want these kinds of cures and drugs really quick. They are not actually more accountable than the state, because these people are actually profit-driven, and these people allow researches that are a little more unethical or ethically ambiguous or something like that. Because simply, for example, in when privately funded companies or researchers like that, pharmaceutical companies, have less disincentive to actually fund these kinds of drugs and go through the procedures that are unethical, like animal testing and things that actually harm these people. Secondly, these these pharmaceutical companies are also less likely to actually respect the boundaries, simply because of the fact that these people still want their money at the end of the day. And because of this, they can invade in indigenous places and get things that actually aren't supposed to be gotten by these people without permission, when they can just do it by waving their stick of money around, and we find that's a problem.